From an idealistic perspective, the Gilded Age marks a time of prosperity and newly adorned power in the United States. Industry was evolving in a way the world had never seen before, with dominance being placed in the hands of massive corporations as the government took a hands-off approach, uncertain of what its role would be in the nation's shifting hierarchy. However, the expansion of the economy was not achieved without causing significant injury to the force that built it: the laborers. One of the strongest forces fighting against the onset of monopolies and other corrupt business practices was a coalition of U.S. farmers. It all stemmed from a single individual, Oliver Hudson Kelley. A former Department of Agriculture employee, Kelley was unimpressed by the lack of sound agricultural practices occurring in the South. This led him to form a new organization called the Patrons of Husbandry, attempting to give farmers an educational and social resource. The organization was divided into local units called granges. Despite a reluctant response early on, nearly every state had at least one grange by the 1870s. The members of granges were drawn together by a mutual exasperation towards monopolistic railroads and the grain elevators in possession of the corporations.
Railroad rates were very unequal. The bigger companies got discounts on their rates, which made it harder for smaller companies to survive, forming a virtual monopoly. Because they weren't regulated, these rates were also very inconsistent. Rival companies divided freight business according to an arrangement that put total earnings in a common fund for distribution. And since the people did not like this led to legislation such as the Interstate Commerce Act.
As cities expanded and began to sprawl, new services emerged onto the scene to support the growing and modernizing population. These services were referred to as public utilities, and they were comprised of young industries such as telecommunications, street railways, and some gas or electricity suppliers. As the United States frontier became increasingly civilized, the need for railways became evident not only through shipping and transport of goods, but also of Americans themselves. Slowly, railroads began to serve as a method of the American public being able to achieve their needs, be it directly or indirectly. The corruption of the Gilded Age spread like an epidemic, affecting businesses and politics alike. Block voting was one of many ethically questionable political practices frequented in the era. The voting choices of citizens were often based off a single characteristics or interest rather than the candidate's visions as a whole. Block voting was often practiced by farmers of the grange, who based many decisions solely off of who would go to the farthest to protect the needs of agriculturalists. Politicians, aware of block voting's heavy presence in the political sphere, could use that knowledge to their advantage, manipulating voters by promising to protect the single interest they were concerning themselves with. It also served to further distance Democrats from Republicans, setting the stage for the dissonance that still plagues our government today. As the anger and lack of trust of members of the Grange spread and began to impact other Americans, it became clear that something needed to be done to alter the malignant practices occurring in the rail industry. Urban merchant groups and shipping interests had also been hurt by these reckless practices and wished to get them in check. From 1869 to 1875, a series of laws was created in the Granger states. The new laws outlined public regulation of railroad rates and operating practices. These outraged the railroads, who were unaccustomed to work under any sort of rule set. Naturally, they immediately began setting lawsuits after these commission-enforced rates.
Railroad lawyers were very intent on declaring the Munn v. Illinois case allowing interstate regulation of railroads to be unconstitutional, using the 14th Amendment as a defense, saying that states could not regulate property. However, the Wabash Supreme Court case overturned this decision and only allowed a federal regulation of property and interstate commerce, including railroads.
By 1887, it became evident that something had to be done about the conduct of the railroad industry, and this time it had to be permanent. The years of being privately owned and unregulated led to Congress's passing of the Interstate Commerce Commission. This act made the railroads the first industry to be subject to federal regulation. Receiving support from both major political parties, the Interstate Commerce Act set guidelines for how the railroads could do business. It applied to railroads exclusively and allowed only just and reasonable rate changes. Special rates and rebates were outlawed for individual shippers, and preference was no longer permitted when setting rates. Pooling of traffic or markets was prohibited, as well as long and short-haul discrimination. But what really set the act apart was its formation of a 5-member Interstate Commerce Commission. This commission would review annual reports from the railroads, ensuring that only lawful activity was being practiced. In 1890, the Sherman Antitrust Act was enacted by the United States Congress. It was the first federal statute to limit cartels and monopolies. It reduced concentrations of power that interfere with trade and reduced economic competition. A key provision of the act was outlawing all combinations that restrained trade between states or with foreign nations. As the voice of corporations in America grew louder and louder, it became necessary for laborers to join together in order to have any chance at retaining some sort of influence in their own country. Because of this, labor unions began to form amongst workers. Bread and butter unionism was the universal goal often sought after by labor groups. The goals of these unionists were simple: to increase wages, reduce hours, and improve working conditions. One of the methods labor unions used to attempt communication with their employers was collective bargaining. This was the process of negotiation regarding issues such as wages and working conditions through chosen representatives. The gap between worker and employer had grown to a seemingly insurmountable height, which made collective bargaining a process coveted by labor unions. It was crucial for there to be some sort of dialogue between the two sides, but this was often not taken into account, leading to the frequent abuse of laborers in the face of a more prosperous industry. Perhaps the most influential of the early unions was the Knights of Labor, found in secret in 1869.
The Knights of Labor, you see, were very controversial, as they allowed African Americans and women in their workforces, not just the men. And this caused some stirring. However, their utopian vision really ruled all and overcame that. The utopian vision of that the workers overcame the employers and ruled them.
Founded in 1886 by Samuel Gompers, the American Federation of Labor was an alliance of craft unions comprised of mostly skilled workers. Their focus was tangible goals such as fair wages and the right to collective bargaining. It differed from the Knights of Labor in that it did not seek for a new social order or for the overthrow of the traditional industrial wage and hour system. The American Federation of Labor gave mainstream American laborers a fighting chance to have a voice in the suffocating grip of massive corporations.
The man who has his millions will want everything he can lay his hands on and then raise his voice against the poor devil who wants 10 cents more a day. Samuel Gompers.
In 1900, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union was formed, composed mostly of immigrants in attempting to improve working conditions and prevent sexual harassment using strikes. The group did not originally consist of women, but rather men who made women's clothing. However, women did eventually participate in the work of the ILGWU. The strikes of the organization compelled employers to limit work week to 55 hours, abolish inside subcontracting of pressing work, provide materials and equipment to workers, and allow an arbitration board to deal with worker complaints. A fire at the Triangle Shirtwaist factory in 1911 resulted in the death of 146 workers, who could not escape from the burning building due to locked doors, broken fire escapes, poor communications with the factory, and inadequate firefighting equipment. The realization that the death of the workers could have been prevented resulted in more cooperation between organized labor, government, and social reformers. In order to accomplish its ambitious goals, the railroad industry employed a massive concentration of the American population. 1 out of every 25 people was employed with the railroad. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 was the first major rail strike as well as America's first general strike. It occurred as a result of the industry's irresponsible slashing of wages and salaries in an attempt to cope with the financial panic of 1873. The strike drastically threatened the economy and resulted in widespread violence as militias were called in to reopen their railways. After the strike, salaries were still being drastically lowered, causing the workers to blockade all freight train traffic and seize rail yard switches, which blocked train movement. Even more violence ensued, and militias had to dissipate the conflict. One of the definitive demonstrations of the international struggle for workers' rights occurred in Chicago on May 4, 1886. The events of Haymarket Square began on May 3rd when one person was killed and several left injured as police turned to violence to intimidate strikers during a union attempt to secure an 8-hour workday. Anarchist labor leaders organized a meeting the next day in Haymarket Square. It began peacefully, but when police arrived and demanded dispersion of the crowd, a bomb was thrown by an unidentified individual, causing police officers to respond with random gunfire. 7 police officers were killed, as well as 60 wounded before the end of the attacks. The civilian death toll is estimated at 4 to 8 dead, with 30 to 40 injured. The problematic relations between labor and management became evident once again in the Pullman strike of 1894. George Pullman, the owner of Pullman Palace Car Company, garnered and maintained control of every aspect of his employees' lives. At the onset of the Depression of 1893, Pullman significantly lowered wages, initiating the American Railway Union to begin a massive strike and a boycott of trains using Pullman cars. A court injunction was obtained against the workers, and President Cleveland sent federal troops to end the strike. The strikers were forced to return to work under Pullman, who died 2 years later, hated by the American people. The Gilded Age is a complex era in which the economy grew and expanded radically as those who carried it were neglected completely or treated with disdain. Many different conclusions can be drawn from this time period, but when looking through the eyes of laborers, it was a challenging moment in America's history. Still, it was the beginning of a new type of lifestyle in which seemingly impossible ambitions would fuel pioneering inventions and reforms. Though they are frequently overlooked, the reactions of those who witnessed events in history must not be ignored, as they are the only true primary source we have to learn from, and there is much to be gained from what they have experienced.